All right. Well, good morning, everybody. So, yep, we're going to start off kind of really big picture and just give an overview of the stream functions pyramid framework and quantification tool for those of you that might be just getting familiar with the tool and the framework. And this is pretty quick. This is big picture, broad overview. So if you would like more detail, the stream functions pyramid, which you can see on the left, is discussed in a document called a function-based framework for stream assessment and restoration projects. This is a document that was published by EPA and the Fish and Wildlife Service in May of 2012. And you can download the document from the Stream Mechanics webpage if you want just more information about primarily about this document, the concept of the stream functions pyramid and the stream functions pyramid framework. This document does not talk about the stream quantification tool. So let's first just have a few slides on the stream functions pyramid. I think the first thing to know is really the stream functions pyramid is just a concept. It's a way to think about how stream functions support each other to create a healthy stream corridor. And it was developed with the stream restoration practitioner in mind to give them this thought process. So if you're a stream restoration practitioner and you want to achieve a certain level of restoration, or you have a certain restoration goal, you need to know what supporting functions need to be in place in order to achieve that goal. That is the primary thought process for the pyramid. So the pyramid looks like this. Underneath the pyramid is geology and climate. And that just acknowledges that, streams in Alaska look different than streams in Arizona, look different than streams in North Carolina, because we have different geology and different climate. Those processes drive all of the processes above there in these 5 categories. So the first thing to remember is that there are 5 what we call functional categories. The base of the pyramid is hydrology, and then next is hydraulics. Third is geomorphology. 4 is physicochemical. There is a C in there. It's not physiochemical, but physicochemical. And then finally on top, the 5th functional category is biology. And then within each functional category, there's a functional statement. And so the functional statement for hydrology is the transport of water from the watershed to the channel. And once that water gets to the channel, it begins to move. And then we have the hydraulic functions, which are the transport of water in the channel, on the floodplain, and through sediments. Once those functions are in place, we have the geomorphology functions, which are the transport, and really we could say transport and storage of wood and sediment to create diverse bed forms or habitat, and dynamic equilibrium or channel stability. And then once those functions are in place, we have the physicochemical functions, which are the temperature and oxygen regulation, the processing of organic matter and nutrients, and then finally is biology, which is the biodiversity and the life histories of aquatic and riparian animal life. We left that word out when we first developed this, but really that was the thought process, is that biology would be aquatic and riparian animal life. And you'll kind of see how that plays out when we get into parameters and metrics. So I mentioned the main thought process is if you want, if you're a stream restoration practitioner and you have a goal in mind, something you want to restore, then what are those supporting functions? So really this is a bit of a look at primary cause and effect with these lower level categories like hydrology, hydraulics, geomorphology, kind of causing the physicochemical and biology response. And the example I often give here is, if you want to do a stream restoration project and you want to bring back a certain fish species, you can't just take a bucket of fish, pour them into a stream and say, you are restored, have a nice life, right? There's got to be the supporting habitat and other functions in place in order to support that fish species. And usually about now, if we were all together, someone would raise their hand and say, yeah, but what about beavers, right? What about beavers? Because beavers would fit into biology. They are an aquatic and riparian animal life form, and they can actually affect all the way down into hydrology. In fact, sometimes beavers are used as a restoration activity to get these types of responses. That doesn't mean this diagram or this framework doesn't work. The proper this pyramid is not meant to be a way to show all of the interactions and interrelationships among these functions, which we know exist. Again, it really is meant to be, if you want a function, what supporting functions do you need in order to achieve that goal? So with beavers, you would say, if we want a healthy beaver population in our river corridor, what supporting functions do we need to have in place to support those beavers? And then this thought process works. So just to kind of put that again into a goal, you know, the goal is kind of the effect. And so in this example, this might be a Great Lakes region or an Alaska goal of increasing the abundance and biomass of Arctic grayling. That would be a biological goal at level 5. And so then we have to start asking questions that go down through these categories. So for physicochemical, excuse me, is temperature too high? Arctic grayling is a cold water fish, so high temperature is often a limiting factor in getting that fish back. Geomorphology, perhaps there's a lack of pools. Arctic grayling like to have pools for refuge. And then hydraulics, or do we have excessive forces that are, or erosive forces that are too high? And then of course for hydrology, do we have the base flow that will support that fish, which may sound obvious, but there are certainly some cases where impacts are so severe that we lose base flow. Sometimes we lose all flow in a channel. All right, so that's just the pyramid and the concept of the pyramid, what we call the broad level view here. We talked about the functional categories and functional statements, but this is part of a framework. So within each of those categories, we have function-based parameters. They describe that functional statement. Attached to the parameters, we have metrics. They quantify the parameter. And then attached to each metric, we assign a reference standard put into a bucket of functioning at risk, or not functioning. And so out of that framework, which it really is just that, it's a way of thinking and a way of organizing our thoughts, we have various applications that come out of that framework. So one application is the concept of restoration potential. We'll touch on that a little bit. Function-based goals and objectives, which is one of my favorite applications, which we're not going to talk about that much here, but both restoration potential and function-based goals and objectives are part of the Wyoming user manual. And then again, the framework, the reason it's a framework is it gives a way to begin to develop stream assessments. So currently, 2 types of stream assessments have come out of this framework. The one we're talking about today and the one that's been the most popular is the stream quantification tool. But there is another one that was called the function-based rapid stream assessment methodology that's primarily used in Maryland and then the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And here's just a map of where current SQTs are either in use or being regionalized. It sort of started in the south. Well, it started in the southeast and in the west. Wyoming and North Carolina, Tennessee were some of the early states. And you can kind of see it's been growing then by regions. We generally have SQTs like in the southeast, Great Lakes region, the Rockies, and then Alaska. And there is, if you want to get the SQTs themselves and the documents that go with them, we have a stream quantification tool page that's on the Stream Mechanics webpage. All right, so moving now into the stream quantification tool, it really is just a spreadsheet tool that quantifies functional uplift. So if we think about an existing condition here on the left, a degraded stream, some type of restoration activity will happen, whether it's planting trees or building a new channel. We have an after condition, constructed as built, and then we can monitor it. So the SQT does assess the existing condition. It can assess a proposed condition, and then it has the ability to assess really any monitoring frequency that you want. Most of the time, those are annual monitoring, so we can begin to see changes or trends of stream condition change over time. It also will do functional loss. So just the stream quantification tool itself, if you took this same stream we were just looking at and you channelized it through an impact activity instead of a restoration activity, then you would get a negative number as an output, and that would represent a functional loss. And we feel like this is important because the SQT is used frequently in mitigation programs. And so by having the same assessment method on the restoration side or mitigation side and the impact side, we can achieve this goal of creating better parity between credits and debits. All right, just want to acknowledge some supporting work that's gone into the SQT. We talked about this document. That was the Stream Functions Pyramid Framework that kind of gives the architecture for the SQT. But then ERDIC came out in 2021 with this document that really is a guide for core districts and interagency review teams, states, anybody working in mitigation to really think through how to develop a function-based stream assessment method. And so we use a lot of the guidance in this document to help regionalize and kind of formulate the SQT. So this document is helping with the stream assessment component, a function-based stream assessment. And then EPA came out with another document that sort of complements the ERDIC document on stream mitigation accounting metrics. And this is the, do you report things in feet or area? We even explored volume. And so these two documents really kind of work together to help create both the assessment as well as how are you going to scale it? What units are you going to put to it? All right, so the primary application for the SQT is single thread channels. I know there's a little bit of eye rolling going on right now because there's a big interest to move from single thread channels to multi-thread channels. We have some workarounds currently that I'll show, and we are moving in that direction. But really, this is where most of the data are, and so this was the logical place to start. Single thread channels that are weightable and primarily that are perennial. But again, guidance is provided in SQT user manuals on how to apply the SQT to other systems, for example, ephemeral and multi-thread. And I will show how that guidance is applied in Wyoming in a future presentation a little bit later. All right, another kind of big picture thought with the SQT is that when we developed it, we put assessment methods in the SQT that are widely used in the stream assessment and stream restoration world, with the thought that a team of professionals who have the academic background and practical training in those assessment methods would work together to collect and analyze the data. That was always the thought process. We never intended for, and not to pick on wetland scientists, but I'm going to pick on wetland scientists. A lot of times what we're seeing is a wetland scientist who has been working for impactors like a DOT doing wetland delineations and wetland restoration. They now see that, hey, there's this new stream tool called a stream quantification tool. I'll just pull it off the shelf, read the user manual, and go out and do that for my client. And you will not be able to do that. The user manuals, the SQT is really intended for fluvial geomorphologists, hydrologists and engineers, plant biologists, which are often wetland scientists, and aquatic ecologists to work together to focus on the assessment method they know to do this work. So kind of think about it like this. You know, these are the assessment methods. We have floodplain assessment methods, riparian veg methods, lateral migration, large woody debris, fish, and so on. So different people with different types of expertise do these assessments, and then they use the SQT to process that data. The SQT will do things like stratify data based on ecoregion, for example. It will then allow you to do assessments for the existing condition, the proposed condition, your monitoring condition, and then the SQT does its work by scoring these assessment methods in terms of its functional capacity and putting all these assessment methods that have different outputs, different units into one common currency, if you will, with these index scores. And then after the SQT processes that, then you get these outputs. And there are two, two primary outputs, the condition scores and the functional foot score. The condition score, you could think of that ERDIC document, like the function-based stream assessment, and then it'll give you metric scores, parameter scores, functional category scores, and an overall reach score. And then the functional foot score brings that unit of measure in, which for all SQTs so far has been stream length, to give you the overall reach score. All right, excuse me. So now I'm going to kind of drill down for the remainder of the presentation. I'm just going to give a shout out to the stream reach, but then Sydney will give a whole presentation on that. I'll give another little shout out to catchment assessment and restoration potential. A little bit more of a shout out to parameter and metric selection, and I'm going to spend most of my time on SQT input and scoring. So I just want to say in this overview presentation that the SQT is reach based, so you are assessing a reach, and it assesses parameters and metrics that are in stream, on the floodplain and riparian area, and even in the lateral drainage area. And again, we'll get into more detail with reach selection in the next presentation, and I'll dig a little bit deeper into lateral drainage area in the key parameters and metrics presentation. So I wanted to give a shout out to the catchment assessment worksheet. This is built into the SQT. It really is catchment assessment and restoration potential. In fact, this is one of the changes for new SQTs, is that we've changed that worksheet name from catchment assessment to restoration potential, because that is the outcome. And so the goal here is to identify stressors in the watershed and downstream of the reach that could limit restoration potential. So what is restoration potential? It is the highest level, and by level we mean highest level on the pyramid. Generally that's geomorphology or biology. You know, can you get to geomorphology, habitat stability, or can you go all the way up to biology and restore biology to a reference condition? So restoration potential is that highest level of restoration that can occur given your watershed condition, your reach condition, and any constraints that you might have. And then this analysis can also be used as a guide for parameter and metric selection, and even site selection for restoration projects. So for parameter and metric selection, a few key things to remember is that the same parameters must be used in the existing condition and then all subsequent condition assessments. So existing, proposed, and monitoring if it's a restoration mitigation site. This is important because the SQT is primarily a delta tool. It's looking at the difference in score between the existing condition and an after condition. And so to keep that scoring fair, we have to assess the same things before and after. Another thing to note is that if you do not score a metric, in other words, you don't put a value in the SQT, it's just removed from scoring. It is not a 0. And so you'll see guidance in the user manual where some parameters and metrics are required and others are optional. But keep in mind, especially for those of you working in the regulatory world, the Corps does have final discretion over what parameters and metrics are used for that project. It really wasn't required and optional, was not intended to be pick the parameters that give you the best score. It was intended to be pick the parameters and metrics that best align with restoration potential and the environment, the landscape site that you're working in. For example, if large woody debris is not part of your system, you would not need to assess it. But if large woody debris is naturally part of that system, you should assess it regardless of how that helps your score. All right, a metric focus, just preference right now is giving the metrics that can be measured rather than modeled. And again, I know we may have some H&H modelers on the call that are like, dang, I really would prefer to model these things than to go out and measure them. But there's good reason in an assessment method that's used, especially in a regulatory world, for focusing on what can be measured rather than what can be modeled. And there's a preference given to quantitative measures rather than just the visual assessment. This aligns better with developing performance standards and monitoring, so people can go out to the site and measure the results of that restoration activity. And it acknowledges that some metrics are just more suitable for design than physical assessment. And so I like to use sediment transport as that example. Sediment transport can be an important process to consider in stream restoration, and we might do a lot of fancy modeling to understand it. But if we get that right, you can go to the field and physically measure things like incision and aggradation to know, aggradation being bar development and bank erosion, things that we can more easily measure than model. And then, I'm often get people will call and say, you need to add such and such metric. And I'm like, that's great. Can you develop a reference curve to go with that? Okay, so we're going to pretty much spend the rest of this presentation on SQT input and scoring. This is where, I guess, the work happens. So after you've done your assessment, then you can come into the SQT, and I guess the workhorse worksheet is the quantification tool worksheet. And when you get to this worksheet, one of the first things you will do is add your site information and reference selection. My recommendation is just to completely fill out this table so you don't get any errors later. But I want to point out that some of the things in this table are just informational. Project name, reach ID, for example, and other things lead to the ability of the SQT to score. And one of the key functions of the SQT is to deal with what we call stratification. So for example here, reference stream type is used by the SQT for stratification. So what does stratification mean? Stratification accounts for the natural variability among stream systems. So reference curves for specific metrics may be stratified by differences in stream type, ecoregion, etc. So let's just take fish as a quick example. We know there are cold water fish and there are warm water fish. So stream temperature could be a way to stratify our reference curves for fish. In this example, I'm using entrenchment ratio. And if you're not familiar with entrenchment ratio, for now, just think of it as a valley width or a flood-prone width. And of course, that will naturally vary by the geomorphology of those valleys. If we have unconfined alluvial valleys, which is where we might have a C stream type, that would naturally have a different curve than stream types like A's through A's and B's that are in colluvial valleys and V-shaped valleys. So there's a different reference curve in this example for these different stream types when you're going to assess the entrenchment ratio. So next is the condition scoring. If we look back to the stream functions pyramid framework, it gave these three categories of not functioning, functioning at risk, and functioning. We call that the functional capacity, and it stopped there. The SQT added the numbers, the range of 0 to 1. And so if we have a 0, that means there is no function for a given metric. And if we have a 1, that means the metric is functioning at a pristine level. It's important to remember this is at a metric level, not the overall reach level at this point. So just for a given metric, and remember there may also be one or many metrics that come together to give a parameter score. The other thing to remember here are these two breaks. So 0.3 will move you from not functioning into functioning at risk, and the 0.7 is the low end of functioning. So I'm going to kind of go into more detail with these reference curves. So here's an example reference curve. It's just a generic reference curve. They all look similar to this in that the x-axis is always what we call the field value. It may be a ratio, it may be meters, it may be feet, it could be anything. Think of this as your metric assessment result. So back to that diagram where I showed assessment results, that is this x-axis. The y-axis is always the same. This is our functional capacity that we just talked about, ranging from 0 to 1. And then here are those breaks at 0.3, breaking us from not functioning to functioning at risk, and the 0.7 from functioning at risk to functioning. And we talked about the 0 index value, meaning no function, and the 1.0 meaning pristine function. And with this reference curve, you know, for this example, about a 7.3 would give you a 1. That means if you got an 8, you still get a 1. Or down here, a 1 gives you no function. And if you were less than 1, that still would be no function. And so the 0.7 to 1 is, we focus a lot, when we're developing reference curves, we focus a lot on this particular range. Like, what is the natural range of variability for reference condition or reference standard? We use those terms synonymously. So I'm going to drill down into this a little bit more. We always get this question, like, how do you develop these reference standards and curves? Because those equations that you just saw are not best fit lines through data. They were strategically placed there by a team of subject matter experts who developed these reference standards and curves. This is part of the regionalization process. And they make their decision using data, existing data, if we have it. Sometimes we go out and collect new data. We also will go to the literature and look in peer-reviewed documents, government documents, conference proceedings or presentations. And then especially when we get into like physicochemical or biology, we often rely on existing state, like water quality programs, to provide their data and help us develop those reference curves. And then sometimes we don't have any of that, and we use the knowledge and expertise of the technical team just to create a logic and rationale for what a reference curve should look like. So our goal in doing this is to not dilute reference condition. This is a problem that we have nationally, if not globally, meaning reference condition is degrading over time when people use best available to equal reference condition. When people say, I'm just going to go out in my watershed and find the best stream possible and call that reference, there are papers that are showing that that quality is going down because we just continue to degrade more and more of our streams. So our technical teams are making a conscious effort to try to keep that from happening. So to do that, we acknowledge that a reference site can vary by parameter. So for example, a young forest might be a great reference for floodplain connectivity and bed form diversity, but not large woody debris, because large woody debris reference should be an old growth forest that is not managed. So reference condition is undisturbed, culturally unaltered. It is not best attainable or best available. So I just want to give you a real world example of how this played out. And I actually don't remember where this set is from, what state it's from, but the point is valid, which is we went out and collected large woody debris data. We use an assessment method called the Large Woody Debris Index. And in this example, it was in forests that were equal to or greater than 60 years. And we collect our data and we generally create a box plot. The normal practice when we do this, if we know this data, if all these data are from reference condition sites, the common practice is to use the 25th and 75th percentiles to create the 0.7 and 1.0 scores for reference condition. That is giving us the range of variability for that metric assessment. But you'll notice in this example that the technical team chose to increase the 0.7 value from about 199 to 355, which was the median. So that median value was used for the lower end because a 60-year-old forest is not that old. So the technical team said, we're going to bump the score up to acknowledge that if we had all forests that were 80 to 100 years old, we think that score would be higher. And they used that rationale to inform the reference condition. And then the 0 is pretty easy, right? If you have no wood, you have no wood function. And so we set the 0 at 0, the 0.7 and the 1. We often do not set the functioning at risk because it is just a transition. So it's pretty common for us to focus on reference condition and not functioning to build these curves. It really just depends on the data sets that we have. All right, so now we can get into scoring. We talked about our data input happens at the metric level. We use those reference curves to create a metric index value. So we're converting a field value, if you will, something that might have units to something that is dimensionless, and always that 0 to 1 that we just talked about. You could think of this as the data conversion. And then once this happens, then the roll-up scoring happens. So these metric scores are averaged to create the parameter score. The parameter scores are averaged to create the functional category score. And then generally, the functional categories are multiplied by 0.2 and summed to create an overall score. So you do have 3 different outputs: the parameter score, the functional category score, and the overall score. This parameter score is the most meaningful, and we do begin to lose meaning as we average and roll up to get an overall score, but they are useful for purposes of showing uplift and then within a mitigation world of creating credits and debits. So here's that weighting that I mentioned. This is most SQTs. Take each functional category. There are 5 functional categories, and just weight them at 20% each, so that if you assess all 5 categories, you are up to a 1.0. If you only assess through physicochemical, then your score would cap out at 0.8. And if you only assess through geomorphology, you would cap out at 0.6, recognizing that there are functions happening that you have not assessed. So Wyoming took a twist on this and said, okay, there are a lot of parameters in geomorphology and not so many parameters in hydraulics and hydrology. And so to even out that weighting, we are going to combine hydrology and hydraulics in the SQT. So you're going to see that going forward, that the Wyoming SQT combines hydrology and hydraulics and gives it a weight of 0.3, geomorphology of weight of 0.3, and then 0.2 and 0.2 for physicochemical and biology. So we're still at a 1.0 through all 5 categories, still at a 0.8 through physicochemical, and still at a 0.6 through geomorphology. Okay, so I mentioned that the condition scoring was an output, and that functional feat is an output for your overall score. Again, the condition change is really what we're interested in for the SQT. So one of the key computations is to take the proposed condition score minus your existing condition score to see that condition change. And then for the overall score, all SQTs currently use stream length as their unit of measure. That might change in the future, we'll see. But for now, it is stream length. So we take that existing condition score times the existing stream length for an existing functional foot score. Same process for the proposed. And then our change in functional foot is the proposed functional foot minus the existing functional foot. We also add some qualifiers. This is for newer SQTs because we realized kind of early on that a score in an SQT is related to those inputs that you answer on your quantification tool worksheet. For example, what stream type are you? What ecoregion? What slope? All these kind of things go into determining that score. So if we just look at the picture on these two pictures on the right, here's a first order ephemeral stream that's very high quality. It scores a 0.8. And then here's a large, barely weightable perennial stream, fourth order. It also scores a 0.8, but these two systems are not functionally equivalent. And so to help communicate that, we put what we call scoring qualifiers. And right now we're just qualifying it by flow type, so perennial, intermittent, ephemeral, and then the Strahler stream order, so first, second, third, etc. And these kind of go together, but the point here is that you would not want to go impact a fourth order perennial stream and then mitigate for it with a first order ephemeral stream. And if you got 0.8 on both sides, to say that was functionally equivalent. We all know that's not the case. So this is just information that the users can use to make sure that we, in a mitigation world, it would be to help prevent out of kind mitigation. All right, I'm just going to end with just an example. So we have an urban stream here, kind of the existing condition on the left, proposed condition, and proposed condition is the condition that you expect at the end of monitoring, not the end of time or a century, but the end of your monitoring effort. So for example, here, 5 years. So our existing, and this particular project only measured through geomorphology, so the max score could only be 0.6. The existing condition score was 0.19. The existing length, 972. The product of that is 185. Then restoration activities were proposed and put in place. And so that proposed condition score went up to 0.35. The stream length was increased to 1280. And so the product of these two numbers is 448. And so the 448 minus the 185 gives us 263 more functional feet after restoration than before in a second order perennial stream. And just wanted to end with some examples of this output. And so this is my favorite output. I think this is the most meaningful output from the stream quantification tool, where you can look at what parameters were assessed. You can see what their existing score was, what their proposed score is. Red means not functioning, yellow means functioning at risk, green means functioning. So you can just see the change by looking at the color, or it'll give you those values as well. And again, I think these numbers and this result is the most meaningful. But we can average these parameters, roll them up, and get functional category scores. Honestly, I don't use this one a whole lot, but it's here if you want it. And then there is a monitoring worksheet. Now, these things look a little bit different for Wyoming. Sydney will get into that later this afternoon when she cracks open the Wyoming SQT. There's improvements from here, but I just wanted to make the point that the SQT does have the ability for you to record not only the existing and proposed, but then you can come out and do your as-built And then you can do whatever monitoring frequency you want. So in this example, it's years 1 through 5, and then they closed this project out, and then we came back in year 13 and measured it again. So you can see some parameters really weren't addressed, and so there was no change, and they're still not good. Others changed to pristine quickly. Floodplain connectivity, practitioners have a lot of control over that, so it went from functioning at risk to functioning and just held that value. And then you can see others, it took a lot of time. This was an urban project. Wood was not part of the design, so there was very little wood during the monitoring period, but by year 13, wood had started to recruit naturally into the channel. So just point being, you can use monitoring to see trends over time. And you can do it at a parameter level, or you can do it at a functional category level, or an overall score level. So for example, here we had a 0.19 for existing, proposed was 0.35. It took time to get to that 0.35. In fact, it took year 5 before that 0.35 was achieved. When we came back in year 13, it was improving, which is what we hope for and what we want to see. And then we can see that the functional feet, was 185, predicted to be 448. We hit that in year 5, and again by year 13, now we're up to 461. So that is all I have.